Hello everyone, welcome to tonight's event. Of course, we couldn't start without a small technical glitch there. This is a panel discussion on innovation in micromobility, and I just want to take the moment to thank you so much for taking the time tonight to come along and take part in this important discussion. My name is Tim Ottaway. I'm one of the co-founders and Project Flock, and I'll be your host tonight. As we gather for this virtual event, physically separated, I'd like to just take a moment to reflect on the meaning of place, and in doing so, recognize the various traditional lands on which we do our business today. For Project Flock and the panelists of this meeting, we would like to acknowledge the Wurundjeri Woi-wurrung people of the Kulin Nation, the traditional custodians of the land on which we live, work, move, and learn. We pay our respects to elders, past and present. We would also like to extend that acknowledgement to the traditional custodians on the lands from which all of you join us today. And as we discuss ideas around movement and mobility, we ask everyone to reflect on the ways in which we move through these lands with gratitude and respect, and how that movement connects us to place. As part of our acknowledgement of country, tonight, we'd love to hear from everybody watching the live stream. Where are you tuning in from? All right, so before I introduce our panelists taking part in this panel discussion about innovation in micromobility, I want to tell you a little bit about why we are here. My co-founder, Marie, and I have been on a journey with Project Flock to learn about how we can contribute to making mobility safer, more sustainable, and more human-centered. Tonight's panel members are just some of the people who have been part of that journey so far. And this event is not intended to be the authority on innovation on micromobility and active mobility, but rather it's our hope that we can make this space for learning and conversation, and hopefully be the first of many conversations we can share on a public platform with all of you. So last year we saw an increase in many people getting more active and outdoors and adopting new modes of mobility. It's really highlighted the importance of how we need to change and adopt new forms of mobility in the future. Tonight's panel will be concerned with some innovations that are happening in micromobility and active mobility. And we're going to be doing that from a user-centered perspective, because at the end of the day, we all want to get home safe to our family and friends, and how we get to that end in a more sustainable, safer, and healthier way is really important to us. So before we introduce our panelists, I'd like to run a quick poll, and we're going to be getting Marie Penny, who's the co-founder of Project Flock, also my partner in life, and she's going to be putting up a quick poll as a bit of a warm-up tonight, just to get all of you involved at home. In a non-COVID, so the poll will be, and it'll come up very soon, in a non-COVID setting, what would be your primary mode of transportation in day-to-day life? We would love to involve you as much as we can. So after tonight's discussion, we'll be fielding some questions from all of you in the audience, and Marie will be putting up some different, trying to get some of those questions up on the screen. Thanks very much, Marie. So I'd like to introduce our first panelist. Her name is Alice Woodruff, and she is the Director of Active City. Alice works with organisations to co-design and deliver projects that encourage people to walk, ride, or catch public transport instead of driving alone to major destinations, such as workplaces, hospitals, schools, and town centres. Alice's practice integrates behavioural insights with transport planning, placemaking, community development, and organisational change. So thanks very much for joining us, Alice. I'm just going to add you now. How are you?
Hi, everyone.
So Alice, I'd just like to ask, can you share with everyone a little bit about the journey you've taken to get to where you are and what you're doing with Active City presently?
Thanks, Tim. In my 30-second summary of probably 20 to 25 years of work, while the short story is I say I'm a transport planner specialising in behaviour change interventions, my training and background is in human ecology and environmental science. So I'm really interested in cities as ecosystems, and with my lens being transport, particularly interested in how we achieve sustainable transport systems. We've got a way to go there. So with a bit of a background in federal and state policy and programs, I've kind of got a big picture lens on the changes and system changes that we're needing to make. And if we're looking at the transition towards sustainable transport, it's easy to focus on the physical networks, the spaces and the urban form that we need to get there. But my focus, with a really strong interest in behavioural insights, is really looking at it from a people perspective. So what are the travel behaviours we need to have a sustainable transport system? So what do we need from our physical environment, but also from our social networks and our influences, and also at an individual level, the individual motivations that we need to be choosing sustainable transport options, and to make them part of our everyday. So I focus on a local level, particular destinations, and I work with organisations to achieve these changes at a sort of place level setting.
Awesome, Alice. Yeah, it was so exciting sort of getting in touch with you initially and hearing about such an important mission that you're on. So thanks for joining us, Alice. So on to our next panelist. Next up, we have Dr. John Simons. He's currently a research fellow at the Institute for Sustainable Industries and Livable Cities, based out of Victoria University. John is an economist who works in many areas of applied economics, including health, the environment, and road safety. He has published economic modelling of road safety interventions in Lancet, as well as case studies in India and Burundi. He is currently extending his research into this area with the FIA Foundation, with a focus on active transport and mobility issues specific to young people. I'm just going to add you. Awesome to have you, John. To start off with, what has been your journey getting into the line of work, and sort of telling us a little bit about also the other things that you're involved in outside of that, some really important research that you're doing?
Hi, Tim. Hi, Alice. Thanks for that. In terms of this sort of area, I've been a evangelical cyclist since I was about 3, I think, and haven't really been able to get me off my bike. I even managed to convince my wife that it would be a good idea to cycle to Europe. So one year we cycled from Vietnam to Greece, which and we're still married, so we survived that. But in terms of this space, I did my PhD in environmental economics in the broader applied economic space, and my focus is on sort of sustainability issues with a particular passion in transport. So I've been fortunate enough to work into the road safety intervention area with lots of really amazing people all around the world. A lot of the projects I do are funded by United Nations bodies like the UNICEF or UNFPA, as well as the FIA Foundation. So a lot of the work I do focuses on low and middle income countries where the majority of safety issues occur, but I haven't been able to stop myself trying to have change in a local environment as well, I ended up starting in a group called Bike West, which is an advocacy group for the west of Melbourne. And the thing that really flipped me to really start that up was that my kids got to an age where I wanted them to be able to get around independently and safely, and I didn't really feel that was possible at the time. So I thought that we really had to strive for change locally. So I come from a broader policy perspective, as well as a sort of a local activist perspective, and both have very interesting insights that you don't necessarily occur from one to the other.
Excellent, John. Thanks for sharing a little bit about the other stuff you do. And when we first spoke, I was really, really delighted to hear that while you're doing that really important research, you're trying to stay really hands-on with the local community. So our final panelist is Ryan Tilley. He's the co-founder of Rove Wheelchairs. Ryan is a design engineer on a mission to enable everyone to access the great outdoors, regardless of their ability. At Rove Wheelchairs, Ryan is primarily in charge of the design and engineering behind the world's first 3D printed titanium wheelchair. These wheelchairs are fully customized to each individual and ultra lightweight. Ryan has also had great success through another business he co-founded by the name of GeckoTracks, where he helped develop assistive tech with the intention to change the way disability products are viewed. Really great to have you, Ryan. We sort of met through RMIT Industrial Design, and I'm really excited about having you as part of this panel tonight. But I'd like to start off with asking you a little bit about what your journey's been to get here tonight, and telling us a little bit about what's happening at Rove Wheelchairs.
Sure. Thanks, Tim, and thanks for having me. Super excited to sort of be part of this conversation and sort of bring in, I guess, some of the accessibility aspects to around the conversation of mobility as well. So as far as, I guess, my journey into sort of where I am today, believe it or not, actually started out with me sort of wanting to be a furniture designer. Sort of growing up from a young age, that was sort of the area that the family business was in, and so sort of working in design and engineering, that was what I always thought was going to be the path for me. But that kind of all changed when I actually attended a summer study tour over in Singapore, which was actually looking at some of the issues that people with disability face and people in general with limited mobility. So that being people like elderly people or people with different conditions that just stop the mobility a lot of us take for granted. And it was on part of that, I was on that tour that I kind of opened my eyes to, what those issues really are. And as part of it, I actually spent 3 days in a wheelchair getting around Singapore. And for me, that was a massive eye opener. And I guess the position of putting myself in the shoes of those people, so to speak, really helped me to get a really good understanding of it. And through that, I met my co-founder Hoy, become really good mates. He's a wheelchair user, and that's sort of, long story short, GeckoTracks sort of came out of that. And so GeckoTracks is sort of an off-road tire made specifically to retrofit to a wheelchair and allow the wheelchair to go onto the beach. So it's a low-cost item and made specifically to get people out and exploring the great outdoors or areas that otherwise are inaccessible for a lot of these people. So that was sort of, that was, long story short, sort of how GeckoTracks formed. As part of that, we were the international runner-up of the James Dyson Award, Engineering Award. Sort of won a few awards along the way with that product, and we're still selling the product, and it's we're getting emails and amazing stories of people, I guess, for the first time spending time with their family on a beach and taking their kids down rather than being stuck in the car park and stuff like that. So that's been awesome. And then more recently, as you sort of mentioned, Rove Wheelchairs, we've developed an ultra lightweight, completely customized chair made for every specific body. For each customer, the chair is specific for them. And so we're sort of in the process now of ramping up production, keeping it all Australian made, and it's quite exciting journey to be on.
Awesome, Ryan. Thanks for sharing a little bit about your journey before coming to the panel tonight. But that's the introduction of all our panelists tonight, everyone. So that's going to mean moving into a little bit of discussion. And where I'd like to start is with Alice. We've had some chats about how important behaviour change is with road safety, with trying to make getting home from work or getting to work or getting down to the shops just a little bit safer. So I suppose what I'd like to start with there, Alice, is what are some of the main challenges faced by you in your line of work and others in your industry when it comes to trying to change behaviour and trying to make things safer and lowering the road trauma toll there every year? Thanks,
Tim. I think I'd start. I was reflecting on this question as the sort of beginning of our conversation, and it's easy for me to jump to the big picture and look at the fundamental challenge is reaching zero emissions in the very limited time that we have available. But in some ways, maybe that's for 7:15 or a bit later in the conversation, because that's a big meaty topic. But I think there's some things there to unpack at that level where the transition to zero emissions is really significant and requires a recognition that travel and travel behaviours are highly complex. And so I will come back to zero emissions, but I think it's better to start with a very local example, and that's travel to school. A lot of my work, I've worked with over 50 schools directly in influencing children's travel to school. As we know, most children still are being driven to school, a big shift over the decades since most of us were going to school. And I think school travel is a real litmus test, or an example of the functioning, the sustainability of our transport systems more broadly, because it isn't just the physical networks and the requirements that are needed for children to be able to walk from home to school safely. Yes, we do need good footpaths, and often they're lacking. Most of our outer metro and growth areas don't have the fundamental infrastructure that's needed for children to walk to school. But there's so much more there to unpack, because the social influences, both at a larger social level within the school community and more broadly around the impact of work arrangements where people are feeling quite pressed to have other commitments, and so their way of dealing with that is driving their child to school on the way to work. So I think it's an example where you need to recognise that it's a complex and integrated issue, and so you can't just address it from an engineering perspective. The work that the framework that I apply with a lot of my projects is from Susan Michie at University College London, where she talks about the COM-B model of behaviours. So there's three kind of interlinking elements here, where it's the capability, opportunity, and motivations together that drive behaviours. So some of these are external, and I think it's easy for us to grasp things like the opportunity. Do we physically have the opportunity to be able to safely walk to school? Do we have good crossing points? Are there signalised intersections? But just as importantly, we need to consider capability and that's both the physical and the psychological capability of both children and families, whether they're feeling comfortable. I've worked with different family groups where they've said, I don't feel comfortable walking in my community. I've been harassed on the street, so I would prefer to drive. So even if you have a fantastic footpath network, that's not addressing that particular issue. And then we also need to look at motivations, which are both personally driven and also particularly socially influenced, about whether you feel it's something that you want to do. Now, I always come back to the fundamentals that, almost all the children, when you survey children on how they'd like to get to school, is that, one, they really want to ride because it's the most fun, but they're always wanting to be active. They want to have time with friends and they want to be outside. So that's a really strong driver or motivator to help influence change. But yeah, I guess what I'm trying to say here is that it's easy to gravitate to some of the engineering and the planning, the urban form elements that we don't currently have, and that there are gaps that we do need to address. But I think we also need to recognise alongside that and integrated with that the social influences that are incredibly important. In Australia, we have strong social norms around car driving, which is very different to other countries. So I think that's just one example that we do need to break down some of those significant social norms and highlight the emerging social norms of people riding their kids to school, or for children, more importantly, to be walking independently.
Yeah, some good points.
I can keep going, but I'm sure John and Ryan have got something that they'd like to contribute.
I had a thought pop into my head, and this might be something I might need your help with, John. I think from some of the conversation we've had about the research you're doing, and I don't claim to be anywhere near as well read as you, but just having a look at some of those statistics from the big report by WHO from 2018, and that younger demographic being so at risk in some countries more than others. What sort of observations do you have, sort of listening to what Alice is talking about there with just trying to sort of change behavior in that younger demographic? And do you see some of those things Alice is talking about come through in some of the statistics in the research that you're sort of carrying out?
Well, I completely agree that while we absolutely need safe infrastructure, it's not enough to really nudge people to take more of an active approach to transport. I mean, we have so many barriers that prevent us, even if the infrastructure's there, to stop us getting on our bikes or walking. I was talking to councils about it and saying not only do we need to have the infrastructure, there's also the issues around the social cultural stuff that Alice was talking about, perceptions of danger. There's legal barriers as well. You have to think, is my bike going to be stolen? And sometimes things around, am I fit enough? Am I confident enough? All those things are factors about whether someone will take up a more active mode of transport, and those things have to be addressed. It can't just be the physical infrastructure, though that is vitally important. In my work, we don't focus so much on the behavior aspect. We look at studies in the sense of, okay, this particular intervention or these particular programs will lead to, say, a certain percentage increase from various observations of, say, cycling or walking, and what are the relative either health or safety flow-on effects from that, and we then model those and look at the economic benefits and costs associated with those. So in terms of the work I do overseas, those issues aren't so prevalent. So if you're talking about, say, Tanzania, the issues around motivation aren't there. They just have no choice. So then the focus is more the physical infrastructure, because they don't have any other options. You just have to make it safer for them to get to schools. And again, sorry to be boring, I completely agree with Alice that the school focus is really, really, really important, because at those ages, people establish habits and patterns of behavior that they carry on into their older ages. Not always, but often. And particularly in those early teens is a significant time when physical activity often falls off a cliff, and we really have to make sure where there are ways of capturing them. So I look at those from the studies that we do overseas, but from a local perspective, in our advocacy group, we also trying to work with quite a few schools and develop up programs to expose kids to include them in more active things, particularly cycling, and give them opportunities that they wouldn't necessarily have before, so that they do get on their bike, whereas it would never have occurred to them before. They would never have that opportunity. So therefore they get that opportunity that Alice is talking about.
Yeah, it's such an interesting point. There's very much this strong theme of, starting in those early formative years of, programs that are related to interventions with children and the youth. But it did bring up something that I think there's also becoming a bit of a common thread there too. And Alice and John, you both mentioned that, this the behaviour stuff is really important. The physical environment is also important too. And John, you mentioned that's quite a big part of trying to work out where to spend money and recommendations that you can put in your research. But Ryan, I wanted to get your perspective with the assistive technologies and working with that, a different group of people to maybe what, some of us do. But talking about the physical environment, is there any barriers you can see there that, with assistive tech and changing behavior around that particular element?
Yeah, sure. I think Alice and John sort of both touched on on a bit on it. That's specifically around, I guess, people's confidence in actually knowing that they can access a building, or they can access the cafe, or that, you know, they can access the place that they're wanting to go. And typically that can be a massive barrier for people in wheelchairs or people with limited mobility, is, you know, just the unknown and the amount of planning that people will need to put in to just do a trip into the city, or you know, just getting around. It often can be so hard, whether it's, you know, is there a train that I can get on, or a tram that I can get on that's accessible? And all of that sort of then plays into, I guess, and affects the behavior of some of these people of not actually wanting to travel, because they could be put in a situation that's embarrassing, or, you know, they could be left there, could be a little bit stranded, and they don't have the, you know, the means to be able to get themselves out of that situation. So I guess when we're talking about behavior change for this group of people, a lot of it does come down to, I guess, knowing that they can access that area, and then having that confidence to be able to do that. That's probably what I'd add into that part of it.
Yeah, some really good points there. And I think I have seen, I'm sure there probably are some programs out there, but I think the point is that how ubiquitous can we make some of those programs? But I have seen a program that I think Marilyn Johnson, who is involved with the Amy Gillett Foundation, she's involved with some training programs for heavy vehicle users, and immersing them in environments where they're on a bike and they get to be, you know, put into the same environment that riders are. And I think it takes me back to what you said after the introduction there. You were going around Singapore in a wheelchair for how long was it?
3 days.
Yeah, 3 days. So I think I personally would love to be able to see the sort of programs that is being implemented with heavy vehicle sort of drivers, and, you know, your everyday sort of able-bodied person putting into a situation where, you know, they have to be immersed into a totally different sort of mode of mobility. And Alice, I was thinking, sorry, what were you going to say?
Oh, look, I was just going to follow on from Ryan's comment that
Sure.
that's a really valuable exercise. Like, I've heard of these immersive experiences, but it's usually an hour or 2 hours. But if it's actually 3 days, you start to get a snippet of an insight of what it's like, you know, that forward planning that's required, and the effort that's involved. And it just made me think, particularly of the work of Bridget Burdett in New Zealand. She works with MR Cagney over there, transport planning specialist, but with a strong focus on accessibility. And she talks a lot about, it's so critical for us as transport planners and practitioners to look at the trips that aren't taken. So often in our surveys, we're measuring, you know, mode share of this and that, and how many people went to these shops and to this destination. But probably the more critical question is, who didn't leave their house, and you know, why weren't they able to do that? Is it that level of uncertainty and lack of confidence of just not knowing the particular steps? Is it already knowing that there's too many steps, there's no step-free environment in the locations that they're needing to get to, so they choose to stay at home instead? And I think that was highlighted particularly throughout some COVID lockdowns, highlighting that people with disabilities were even more cut off than people that were able to get out and about and just have at least those windows of freedom, which many people haven't got. So I feel like we've got a very long way to go in our transport system just for it to be inclusive from a physical perspective, let alone the other points that John was talking about feeling the perceptions that people have about safety and confidence.
Yeah, really good points there. And this was something I also wanted to ask you a little bit about, Alice. And it was really it was at a time where I think that you know, Marie and I were starting to reach out to people like yourself. And the point was, I think one of those first times we met was changing language and changing the way in which we frame, you know, instead of cyclists, it's people who ride bikes. And I think yeah, it was a particular paper, or it was a piece of research that you brought to our attention, and it's quite illuminating just to start to really raise awareness about language can have such an important sort of an important role in that behaviour change. Can you talk to a little bit to that?
Yeah, sure. It's a piece of work that I've been involved in, led by Vic Health, and also supported by the Municipal Association of Victoria and other organisations, including Victoria Walks. But Vic Health commissioned Common Ground to do a piece of work. They do great insights into social and environmental issues and how to reframe communications and messages to build support and strengthen support for particular causes, whether that's gendered violence or climate change. But in this case, we were looking at walking and bike riding. Given the shift in behaviours that we've seen during COVID, there was a project led by the MAV and Vic Health to look at the opportunities that we could seize here to support councils to do more work and encourage more walking and bike riding in their local areas. So this work focuses on what's called values-based messaging. So we all share common values, but there's recognition that for particular causes. So here we're wanting more people to walk and ride bikes. There'll be the strong supporters, probably everyone on screen at the moment, and most of the people in the chat. Then there'll be people that can be persuaded, the persuadables, and then there's the opposition. And this is done quite. With a lot of rigour. They use surveys and survey people on the language that's being referred to. For example, using roads increases more of an oppositional response to using streets, for example. It's the same with cycling. People don't relate to being a cyclist. They see that as an elite activity, people in Lycra, but people do relate to being, I ride a bike, I'm a bike rider. But so this piece of work has looked quite intensively at the language that we can use to better frame the conversation to encourage more walking and bike riding, to help shift what is about 65% of people from persuadables to the supporter group. So another example here is, rather than talking about closing roads to cars, it's about opening streets and making them safer for everyone. So opening streets to people who are walking, bike riding, scooting. And I think that is really critical. Again, it just comes back to what are our shared values. We all sort of recognise the importance of fairness and equity, that people should be able to safely get to their destinations. And so rather than focus on the dangers which shift us into values about sort of self-protection and threat aversion, it's about connecting people. And I think for me, the fundamental is just a reminder that it is all about us as people. So I'm not a bike rider, really. I'm a person who rides a bike. I drive a car. I catch public transport. I walk a lot. And I do these things in different ways for different purposes and at different times. So it's just really valuable work. I think there's a question in the chat. I think there'll be a summary paper on the Vic Health website, and I'm happy to share the report if people want to reach out to me.
Awesome. It makes me think, I was walking down Sydney Road just here in Brunswick just the other day, and it's a sign. It must be almost 2 or 3 foot wide, and it says it's just watch for, and it's just got a symbol of a bike, and it's just it's something insignificant, but really if you have that sort of signage and you're surrounded by it day in, day out, it makes no indication whatsoever that it's watching out for another human being. It's making reference to a machine. And it's a piece of research I think I keep coming back to again and again through my personal journey with Project Flock, and it was a research paper that came out of it was a bit of collaboration between a number of different bodies. John, you might be able to correct me if I'm saying this incorrectly, but I think it was between a couple of unis and possibly CSIRO. It was about the dehumanization of cyclists. And they surveyed quite a few drivers, and they sort of said that, you know, cyclists are less than human. So it's just this, it's a real cluster when you look at something like that, because there's quite a few things at odds with each other there. It's wrong language. It's quite a few things going on, and it really brings out the worst in people. Do you know which one I'm talking about there, John?
I've got a few articles in my files. I'm just trying to remember which particular one that it was. I can certainly dig it up. But the language is incredibly important. I mean, and it's curious that cyclists, it seems to be in sort of, you know, English-speaking countries, get labelled as cyclists, when no one goes around, oh, I'm a public transportist, or, you know, I'm a walkist, you know, pedestrian. No one identifies their whole being in that way, the way they move around. You know, nearly everyone who rides a bike will either walk or catch the train or the bus sometimes, or drive a car sometimes. They're just people, you know, and sometimes the bike is the best way to get around. Sometimes walking is the best way to get around. Sometimes driving the car. I mean, I'm a fanatical about cycling, but my family, we have 2 cars because we can't use bikes all the time. There are things where the car is more appropriate in our city. But it seems to become almost a derogatory term, cyclist, and I think it's unfortunate, and it's where people lump that derogatory sort of aspects around people who, you know, do wear Lycra, usually people just like me, middle-aged men in Lycra, who, you know, ride fast, can sometimes be a bit rude or not as courteous as perhaps they should be. So therefore, anyone who rides a bike is like that. And it's just, you know, it's something we've got to get away from. But by doing that, you've got to encourage those people, find ways of encourage those people who broaden the cross-section of people who are prepared to get on their bikes, so it will become less of an issue.
Yeah, totally. I think it's definitely, that raising awareness around that, and it's certainly changing paradigms with how I think quite a few, you know, government through to even commercial companies are trying to communicate and trying to affect change without sort of shooting themselves in the foot.
And that comes back to the Geller classification, which I'm sure a lot of people watching are aware of. You've got the 4 categories, and they seem to change a little bit from one country to the next, but there seems to be some consistency. You've got the strong and fearless, who are, you know, a tiny percentage. You've got the enthused and confident, who are a few percent maybe, and then you've got the interested but concerned, who make up 60-70% of the population, and then you've got a lot of people who don't really ever want to cycle. But because the only people who currently cycle are those strong and fearless, and perhaps sometimes a little bit antisocial, so therefore that means all that people associate, therefore that is what cyclists are. But no, it's just a sampling error, without getting to get too scientific about it, about you're associating a tiny group of people, saying that everyone is like that. It's just not the case. But so once we get a broader cross-section of society cycling, then that should become less of an issue. But, you know, we've got to get to that point.
No, good points there, John. And Ryan, I thought, sorry if this is catching you off guard here. I just thought when I went to go and see Rove Wheelchairs at the what's the name of the big show that was on for all the assistive tech and products in Melbourne that was on?
Yeah, that's a trade show.
Yeah, so cool to go along and see such a wide range, such a wide spectrum of innovation happening in that assistive tech sort of vertical. But what do you see some sort of emerging projects or emerging products that are trying to get peoples with disabilities in on being able to, you know, because I think there's a bit of another common theme coming up here is the trips that aren't happening and the trips that could have been. But is there any indication from your end, like what's happening to innovate in that sense and get together, and get people with disabilities a little bit more empowered to get active on you know, bicycles or variations thereof?
Yeah, sure. I mean, I guess I'll firstly, I think there's definitely not enough innovation in sort of the mobility disability sector. Like it seems to be, it's like 10 years behind the cycling, technology. It's and I haven't been able to put a finger on exactly why I think that is, but I think technically it's like it's a smaller percentage of the population, and therefore the funding and things like that haven't been there to actually promote a lot of that innovation. And I guess part of my mission is to actually enable that, create some really nice looking products, like, because a lot of it is just functional and it doesn't look any good. And a lot of people, it comes down to confidence as well. If you're sitting in a wheelchair, like it's a part of you and it's an extension of you. But sort of that rant aside, I guess, of the innovation not happening in that space, probably the biggest things I've been seeing at the moment is sort of the introduction of like electronic assist and the e-assist sort of platforms, and that's also coming into cycling as well. And maybe, the sort of the disability sector, mobility sector has been a little bit behind in the take up, but it certainly is happening. And that certainly allows people to, first of all, they can travel a lot further without having to rely on a car or rely on some other form of transport, whether that's for example, like an attachment that goes on the front of the wheelchair and it's sort of like a little electronic motorbike, or there's there's attachments that fit onto the back of a wheelchair which actually sort of augment or assist when you push. So it's still very manual, but it's like an e-bike that just adds in the power when needed. But all of that just allows people to be a lot more mobile. They can go for a lot further down to the shops and they don't have to hop in the car to do that. And for a lot of people, hopping into the car can be quite a time-consuming process. But also, if you're sort of talking about the biking side of things, for a lot of the active people, and John, talking about the fearless kind of, personas, there's in the active sort of people, I guess there's like the e-assist is coming into sort of, recumbent bicycles and adaptive sort of four-wheel bikes as well. So that also then allows those people to actually keep up with, if you're talking in a recreational setting, to keep up with other people on, your standard two-wheel bikes, for example. And it means that they can be more included in activities, which ultimately makes things a lot more fun for everyone. So that's probably the biggest things I've seen.
Yeah, it's pretty eye-opening stuff, and I think this brings up another point for me. What we're seeing happening with micromobility, the idea of assisting and kind of augmenting what are some traditional forms of sort of pedal assisted or assisted sort of transport modes, is like, for example, up in Brisbane at the moment, and this is something that I might need your help with, Alice and John. Up in Brisbane, I think there's 2 or even 3 separate scooter rideshare companies all trying to vie for use up there at the moment. And it seems like a pretty funny, but at the same time, very appropriate place to really test if something like that can work. Because Brisbane it's an interesting sort of case study if you look at public transport and transport networks in general compared to that of Melbourne. What's the horizon looking like for that sort of micromobility, specifically scooters, looking like in Melbourne? Maybe, I don't know, from Alice or John, I'm not too sure if either of you are across much.
Well, I'll jump in. I'm not over the stats, but certainly there's significant, even though they're not technically legal on the roads, there's been a huge increase in the use of scooters. Personally, people, buying them and zipping around the place. But in a positive way, the state government has committed to doing a trial, which I think is really important, because there are some growing pains as we bring in new technologies. I think there's a huge potential benefit of having more micro-mobilities available. They do provide an opportunity to hopefully convert some short car trips. We still have, I think it's 40% of car trips under 2 kilometres in Melbourne. So there's a big potential to shift a lot of those to a micro-mobility option. The challenges, though, is that we don't currently have the system and the networks in place to really support that, and some of the regulations and social norms around how we bring those new technologies into play. And I think an example where it is a challenge is that in Brisbane they have been zipping around on footpaths, and a lot of people would argue, certainly Victoria Walks and other walking advocacy groups are saying, footpaths are importantly for people who are walking, and there is potential safety risks and clutter and challenges of having them on the footpath. So it's more, how are we integrating them into our whole streetscape, sort of, from building edge to building edge. And that means, for me, looking at how we're currently distributing the space, which is mostly taken up by cars, and giving more space to people using these other micro-mobility modes, because there is really great potential. I think there's some of the stats I've seen globally is that they are high use for young white men. So that's it's a bit of a, dare I say, boys with toys in some, particularly in the US. But I think there's definitely a role to expand and make them a more diverse, used by a diverse range of people to fill a gap. And yeah, there's real benefits, but I think some of the trade-offs that we have to work through like having a planned trial to just resolve some of those issues about where do they get parked, and how do they interact with other modes on our streets. And, so I think great potential, but we do need to work through the detail, and that's where government needs to be probably much more nimble and responsive, as tech is changing so rapidly. And that's been the challenges with a number of countries and cities, where they've had them kind of dumped on them rather than working in a partnership to go, how's it going to work for our city and our people?
It's really interesting, and I think I think just the other day, Alice and John, I think all three of us had probably had a conversation here or there with people from Bicycle Institute of Australia and WeRide, and there's people that work within that organisation which are really busy trying to navigate what is an incredibly hard landscape and an intersection of lots of different stakeholders there. It does bring up a little point for me here, and the sort of cityscape we have, and a really big sort of micromobility user that's out on our roads right now is logistics and food delivery. And I think what was making the news a lot last year with the pandemic was we saw a really big sort of spike in food delivery, micromobility users being out on the road. And I think there's really promising innovation. There should be more innovation in trying to safeguard these people, these users on these micromobility sort of modes of transport, but also just how can those short trips be leveraged more so? Because is there anything that all three of you really that have come across with anything to do with that sort of micromobility and logistics sort of overlap?
Well, if I could just a couple of comments. I mean, I don't know a lot about the scooter world, the e-scooters, but in terms of the e-bikes, they are, I'm firmly convinced, the future. And that's just not as the personal mobility, but also in cargo. E-cargo bikes are they're going to be enormous for that, that last mile solution they talk about, even beyond that, because of their efficiency, the amount of space. We have, as you mentioned, the Bicycle Industry Association lobbying hard in Canberra. There's all sorts of issues around what is legal in terms of how large a motor and what speeds and those sorts of things, which are going to seem to be taking an inordinately long period of time to get those changes through. But the potential is enormous for those sorts of things. because you can carry, some of these things you can carry up to 200 kilos on these e-cargo bikes, and they can be zipping around in a far more efficient and effective way. One report I recently read is that 30% faster delivery times in New York using those e-cargo bikes. So once people twig that they're actually going to save money, they're going to be more profitable if they use this option. I think that will be a real driver, and all these sorts of innovations which I haven't even begun to think of yet will occur, which will bring about that paradigm shift to more of that micro mobility and the e-assist.
Yeah, totally agree.
Like Ryan basically coming up with super clever stuff, and then a couple of years later I go, oh, I know this guy Ryan, isn't he great? Anyway, that sort of thing.
Yeah, who knows, mate? Maybe Ryan and myself. I don't know. Who knows? But
of course. Sorry.
of course.
Future collaboration team.
Yeah, exactly. John, I wouldn't mind asking a little bit more about, I suppose all of us in this particular panel, we're all in Melbourne. It's in some ways it's quite a unique setting for mobility and the way we get around our city, even compared to some Australian cities. But I'd love to hear a little bit more about, for the audience, because I found it incredibly fascinating. From the research that you do, there's a really, really big difference, a big disparity between the way we get around and those statistics compared to some countries around the world. And I suppose, how does that affect the output of your research? How does it affect, some of those statistics that are going to stakeholders that are trying to make change?
You're talking about mode share and that sort of stuff. So
yeah.
Or in terms of the people who, the massive road toll each year, which countries and different. Well, in terms of mode share, obviously, the obvious one that everyone talks about is the Netherlands. I don't want to talk about the Netherlands. The one that I love talking about, and I was lucky enough to visit for 3 days, was Seville in southern Spain, where they didn't have a history of cycling or walking a bit, but they managed to install 80 kilometres of protected, separated cycling infrastructure, a real connected network, and then almost overnight, about 10%, wasn't 10%, it was close-ish to 10% of their trips were then taken on by bicycle, because the opportunity, that people then got the opportunity, before they even finished the network, people were jumping over the barriers to start riding around on their paths because they had the opportunity which previously they didn't have. And so now that they've got to a stage where and I was lucky enough to be taken around by the network by the people that lead, the guy who was the head of the advocacy group, who's Ricardo Marquez, and the guy who designed the network, Manuel Calvo, and showed me all the issues that they had to come up with. And I said, how on earth did you get such a narrow, what was your standard for this narrow section where you could go around this 1,000-year-old building? How did you squeeze in your bike path there? He goes, there were no standards. We just made it up as we went along. So, and that's one of the issues that I find very frustrating in Australia, is that a lot of the standards seem to be designed in a way to prevent stuff going in. And that goes back to the sort of thing Alice was talking about in terms of the road space, the allocation of road space. So much is allocated to motor vehicles, and just maybe little snippets. Well, in some areas, there's a lot of good pedestrian infrastructure, but it's very rare to find good protected cycling infrastructure. And that one guy, I think he's a Danish guy, talks about the arrogance of road space, road allocation, where it's just assumed, cars will take the vast majority. I mean, it doesn't have to be that way, where you can reallocate things in a very clever way to make space for things like people on e-scooters, to make it work, not them having to go on footpaths and knock over pedestrians, and that causes all sorts of furor. But it takes a bit of courage to do these sorts of things, but it also takes a bit of vision to say we don't have to do things the way we've always done them. But I could talk about...
We're at a very critical juncture. We're several decades already behind. Our tracking towards zero emissions in transport, and it's fundamental, and we need some visionary leadership right now. You probably saw perhaps in today's paper the Auditor General's report into our transport and major projects in Victoria, and I think, you know, quite reasonably caning the department for focusing on large infrastructure projects without a clear and articulated long-term forward transport plan for the city and the state, and so that's where we don't have, without that bigger direction, it means that we're sort of dealing around the edges, and each local council is haggling over particular changes in their local infrastructure rather than having a shift in approach to recognising that we do need to change how road space is allocated. For rapidly growing cities, we need much more efficient transport systems, which are high capacity public transport supported by good connected walking and bike riding to allow for those long urban trips, and then, you know, good local trips by walking and bike riding. It's interesting. We've been tonight's theme around micromobility and innovation. Someone said the other day, oh, you know, this big focus on smart cities. A smart city is one where everyone can actually walk. You know, walking as a general term for people, you know, with disabilities, as, you know, assisted mobilities for walking. But I think that is the fundamental, that we actually need to come back to that and recognise that if you get that right, good walking catchments into high quality public transport, then, you know, we're moving a long way. But at the moment we're grappling around individual council by council because we don't have those bigger, the broader framework and some of those the more responsive regulations where you say, well, we used to do it like that, but now we've got enough flexibility in our guidelines that we can do it like this. Because, and it's not like it's new. There's plenty of guides out there. All of the NACTO guides already show a different way of being able to support micromobility. You know, an increase in micromobility options.
And in addition to that, it's including other people in the decision-making process, because traditionally in Australia we just, it's sort of engineering approach to roads or getting around, whereas in Europe they try to work with this, what they call sustainable urban mobility plans, or SUMPs, where they get lots of different people from different backgrounds contributing to the conversation. You know, well, you know, that won't work for me. I can't get my wheelchair up around that, whatever, or, you know, I don't feel safe in that space. You know, you might be able to drive your car down there at 60 kilometers an hour, but that's not relevant to me. I need a different form of an urban form. So having different perspectives to contribute to those things, it can get pretty messy, but I think it achieves a better outcome for everyone.
Yeah, some really good points there, and I think, it makes me think that if it's not just changing what's on the road and share on the road, but it's about really affecting how cities are built. And I loved what you said, Alice, about, you know, there's all this terminology thrown around when we talk about smart cities, but they just need to be cities that just work and just use common sense. But you know, the problems are so wide spanning, and I think it would be lovely to have the perspective of an architect, because I think there's so much overlap between that built environment and the road, and very much the space in between. And Ryan, I don't know if it's okay to ask, but I was going to ask, is there any sort of standards? Is there any sort of barriers that someone like yourself designing assistive technology, is there any of that sort of barriers that you come up against trying to design for, or try to find innovative ways to help, you know, people with disability navigate what is, you know, a tricky environment between standards in the built environment and standards on the road?
Yeah, Yeah, I think, I mean, coming back to, I guess, the concept of disability, often it can be viewed that the person is only disabled by their environment, and that comes really down to the infrastructure that's available and, how someone might navigate that. But I guess to try and put it into perspective, it really helped me sort of when I was trying to understand it. Like, a lot of the stuff that we take for granted, the bike lanes, the stairs, the roads, they're really all they're accessible infrastructure, using the modes that we're most familiar with. Whereas I guess the accessible infrastructure that also needs to be there is the things that allow wheelchair users to get around easily, but whether they be ramps, instead of stairs, or lifts, or not having that step in the front of the cafe, because that just totally makes that place inaccessible. So I think like that mindset shift of understanding that a lot of the infrastructure that's out there already is actually just accessible infrastructure for the current modes that we're using, and actually then just applying that I guess thinking into actually considering others as well, that the current infrastructure doesn't allow. And there's flow-on effects for this, for example, like installing ramps and not having steps to get up into buildings and stuff like that make it a lot easier for wheelchair users. It also helps people like, mums that have got prams and other people that are, carrying or rolling things. Like it still makes it easier and more accessible for a whole broader sort of scope of people. And so I think, yeah, there's certainly a lot of consideration that needs to be done between, say, like a road environment and then like your final destination of the building or work or home or whatever it is. There's a lot in there. And I guess when we're designing products, for the wheelchair and stuff like that, like it's trying to understand what those environments are. It's very hard to be able to take into account everything because it's totally changing. But there's some pretty cool projects out there of stair climbing wheelchairs and stuff like that. Obviously, that's taking into account that there are old infrastructure out there that's not going to change immediately, and that then comes down to sort of the thinking of how can we enable the person as opposed to relying on the built environment as well. So I guess there's sort of two ways of sort of approaching it.
Yeah, personally, I think with the work we're doing at Project Flock, we're not sort of in the same space as you necessarily, but it is trying to find a common thread between what is the thinking, what is the methodologies. And Alice, what you brought up earlier in the panel, in the discussion was, we've really taken a lot of those methodologies to heart. But it's about, how can we provide short-term impact? And it's that balancing act between trying to use existing infrastructure, as you say, a product which climbs stairs, and then the tension between that and trying to innovate something which completely blows apart the the traditional notions of going up something and does it have to be stairs and all that sort of thing. So I wanted to, is there any other points that come to mind for Alice, John, or yourself, Ryan? Because there's something that I wanted to have a bit of a chat about. What do you think?
Just in summary, to sort of finish off Ryan's points, just coming back to Bridget Burdett's work, and she summarises, planning for accessibility as safe, obvious, and step-free. So if every transport practitioner, urban designer, major projects officer puts that in their, framework, I think that's a good starting reference. That it's not rocket science, a lot of this work. It's just being much more engaging early on with a very diverse group of people to say, are we actually planning the environments in a way that works for you and enables you rather than limits you.
Yeah, I think touching on, just to reiterate that, Alice, I think making sure that those people that use wheelchairs, that use other forms of mobility, are engaged in that planning process is like critical, because often it can be overlooked or assumptions can be made, and it's just totally wrong. And I've seen it so many times, and it, even in product development, there's there's people that are, you know, able-bodied, I guess, that have designed products, and they're just not even close to sort of hitting the mark for the people that they're actually supposed to be designed for. And for us, a lot of our philosophy is, you know, designing the product for, but with those people, and bringing them along in sort of the whole development process. So I think that's the same for infrastructure and big projects, is making sure that those people are included, and that their voice can be heard as well.
It's really interesting, having sort of come through my formal study as an industrial designer, and what was kind of, I don't know, the messaging I got from where I went at RMIT Industrial Design was, it seemed like a lot of the user-centered design thinking seemed to be relatively new, but it just makes you think, I mean, in the scheme of things, but it does make you think that having that user-centered design approach to all forms of, you know, planning and design is just such a crucial, it's the glue that's going to, you know, bring all those different disciplines together. And it's just interesting. I don't know. I see people, it's sort of like the trendy thing to do. And I think it's become quite ubiquitous, but you still see it around in different disciplines, that it's this trendy thing that you do every now and then to make work a little bit less boring, it seems. But it's something that definitely needs to become, very much the status quo for built environment, all the way through to transport planning and everybody, all the other disciplines involved.
Honestly, I think it's common sense to, include those sort of people. But like at the end of the day, if you want to, you break it down hard, like it makes sense for businesses to consider that, because the project or the product is going to work so much better. So, yeah.
Mm-hmm. This for me talks a little bit to those UN Sustainable Development Goals, setting out a really clear guideline, and in a lot of cases, somewhat a clear roadmap. And, I think if more people were sort of looking at that as a little bit of a, somewhat a guiding sort of rule book to helping them, start at the very start of the inception of concepts for innovation for micromobility, that would certainly put us all in a better position. Alice, what with some of those UN SDGs, and you talk about getting to zero emissions, are there any other goals that I suppose this is probably going back into this near the start of the panel, we're talking about sort of or maybe even a previous conversation, the amount of money that's put into sort of cars and certain infrastructure really needs to be redirected in different ways. Does that ring any bells for you? I'm just trying to think if what that was you or John I was talking to about.
I think that might have been me, not sure.
Right.
The UN put out a report saying that 20% of the road budget should be dedicated to active transport. That was a few years ago. As a way to, we keep going back to infrastructure, and obviously the focus is a little bit different on tonight in terms of behavior change and micro-mobility sort of innovations. But that aspect of you need to have a safe space to move in for those things, those innovations to be used on. 20% is what they recommend. Not many places do that. Not many places see that as, their goal. That's one of the things we found, for example, in Burundi, where the infrastructure is truly, truly appalling. And they have a massive road toll. It's predominantly males between the age of 18 and 24. And they just said, no, it's not a problem. We don't see that massive road toll as an issue. So that's very hard to get the focus on putting money into that safer forms of transport.
Mm-hmm.
But there are examples where it does occur, but that is a recommendation. And there's all sorts of different approaches you can take with different focus. Sorry, I'm just getting over to you.
I was on mute. Yeah, no, John, really good points there. And I think, the conversations we have had are really been opening up my eyes to, what's happening out of our ecology here, our mobility ecology here in Melbourne, Victoria, Australia. But I suppose I'm just wanting to bring up, we're coming up to 7:45. We're sort of nearing the end of the panel discussion. I just wanted to put it out to all three of you, Ryan, John, and Alice. Is there any other points that are coming to mind for you? Any other things to discuss before we sort of start to wind up the panel tonight?
I guess just coming back to looking forward towards a zero emissions transport system, and there's been a lot of focus nationally at a federal and state level on electric vehicles, and I would say that yes, they definitely have to be part of the solution, but it feels like they are dominating the debate at the moment about how we transition to zero emissions. And for me, I think there's as equal, if not greater, opportunity around electric bicycles to support and strengthen better public transport, so that we do have other travel options, because focusing solely on electric vehicles really is just continuing with business as usual in the way we're planning and managing how we move around our cities, yet in the context that our cities are rapidly growing. We'll have 8 million people in Melbourne by 2050. And so we need to reduce space and energy intensity of our transport, as well as be much more broad in our consideration of the impacts of transport, both from a public health as well as a road safety, road trauma perspective. So at the moment, we've got, huge rates of, low levels of activity, high rates of sedentary lifestyles. Focusing solely on electric vehicles won't address these matters. So we really need to look at the issue in a more complex and integrated way, and focus on mode shift away from private cars as much as we can, as well as providing the technology, that electric vehicle technology uptake, and supporting that, a transition to that. But I think my call to action, if I had one, was, let's give as much priority around micro mobility and e-bikes as a way forward to help transition to zero emissions for transport.
Nice, Alice.
I agree more with that, because e-bikes, if you get just e-bikes, because you get people who wouldn't ride, who wouldn't dream of riding, they'll find themselves riding. They ride more often, they ride further, and lots of studies have shown that they actually, people who ride e-bikes ride more than people who have previously riding just on a traditional bicycle. So that they just increase the catchment of the people who will ride a bike, and they ride it more often, they ride it further, and they're just absolutely key in terms of a emissions point of view. They're 10 times more effective than electric vehicles, and and it's cheap to get them run up and going, and to infrastructure, they don't take much space. It's such a no-brainer. We really have to push for e-bikes for in all manner of forms, whether it's personal or for cargo, and my other core to arms is help your local advocacy group to really, because they are, from a personal perspective, completely stretched trying to hammer on the door of whatever it's a state government department or local government to say, this is crazy, we're just repeating the same things we've done for the past 50 years, we need to change. And they're only going to do that if people get out there and knock on their doors and bang down the council door.
Nice, John. Yeah. What about you, Ryan? Any other sort of closing thoughts or musings?
Yeah, I think, I guess still talking about the electronic or e-assist stuff, like that's what I've sort of, and I touched on it before, but like just the boosting confidence of people that otherwise wouldn't make a trip, now making a trip, the ability to, for example, access places or areas that they wouldn't have otherwise, steep inclines and stuff that people might not be able to physically push themselves up, but with the electronic assist, can find that they're easily able to do that, whether it be a steep ramp, which I noticed someone sort of mentioned in the comments before, they can still do that. And obviously, you know, a steep ramp probably wouldn't meet current building code as well, which is, you know, so not something I'm totally sort of across is in different codes. But just going back to the eAssist, like just the confidence that it gives people, the different places it allows people, and probably the more importantly, the ability to be able to keep up or be more included with a group of other people that might be able to access those areas easier. Just the being included with friends and family, like that flow-on effect from health benefits is huge, being both physical and mental. So that'd be sort of my parting things as well. And ultimately for us, like having some of that, you know, there's a lot of innovation happening in the bike industry and in other verticals, but having all that, then, you know, and I'm trying to work on it, but having more people with that innovation in the disability and sort of mobility sector is, I think, massive, and that would be sort of my call to arms.
Awesome. Thanks, Ryan. I suppose what we can do is we can go and see, now that we're sort of starting to wrap things up, I wanted to ask all the viewers on the YouTube live stream there to see if there are any questions. I do know there is one already from Todd Ward. So Todd Ward has asked, do you think e-scooters as a mobility as a service sort of vertical is the way to go, or should the option of self-owned e-scooters also be an option? I sort of had a bit of a thought on this. I think that they could be the same thing. I think that if someone comes up with a really cool business model, you could sort of, I don't know, rent to own or subscribe to own. But I really think that mobility as a service is definitely the future in terms of making that micro-mobility, having a fast and efficient way to access short trip mobility. Micro-mobility is perfect for this application. That I think both can happen possibly in the same business model. Any other thoughts from the rest of the panel there?
Yeah, I'd agree. And look, there'll always be people who want to have their own device, their own car, their own e-scooter, but mobility as a service is definitely the way forward. And it does flip back to being us as people choosing our transport options as we need them for different trip types and you know, purposes. There's a good, interesting trial that's just getting underway with, I think, supported by Transport and Main Roads in Queensland and University of Queensland. That's going to be the case study site. And I've forgotten the other key partner in the project, but if you Google it, it's I think it's called Odin, is their mobility as a service trial that they're running, and they are looking to connect in the e-scooters that are currently out and about in Brisbane as part of that trial. So that'll be interesting to get some useful data from a pretty large sample with, there it is, iMove Australia, great.
iMove, yeah.
Yeah, with a pretty large sample of staff and students from University of Queensland. So I think that's running over the next year or so.
No, it's really
I was actually
cool. It
talking
does remind me.
Sorry.
You go, John, sorry.
I don't do business models. I'm not a business person, but you know, it seems like the opportunities there. I was talking to someone who's involved with trying to develop some e-cargo bikes and some retrofit technology just a couple of days ago, and he envisaged being able to retrofit it on to your bike and have a locking mechanism with it as well. That was all app-based. So not only could you have your own e-bike, then you could use it just like in car share. You could actually, you know, rent out your bike. People could hire your bike. So it's both. It's something you own and also something that is a service as well. So I think there's enormous potential in different areas.
Yeah, definitely. There's lots of cool stuff happening over in the US. It's always been a hotbed for some cool innovation. But I think I'm just trying to see if there's any other questions coming through. But I suppose one other thing I did want to mention is right now there's a company called C-Sense who are also doing in the bike light sort of product game, same as Project Flock, at least at this stage. And they're doing a really cool thing where they're doing working with Deakin University and TAC, and they're using bike lights as a way to actually gather data, user data on how cyclists, how people who ride are navigating around cities. and trying to build up some of that sort of casualistic data. But yeah, it does beg the question, thinking back to what we talked about earlier in the panel, how do we capture the data about the trips that, are just not to be just yet for some people in the community? So really interesting work there by C-Sense. I think unless there's any other little comments to add there from Alice, John, or Ryan, I'm probably going to start to wrap things up, if that's okay from all of you. Cool. Let's see, where am I at here? Questions from the audience, we've done that. That brings us to the end of the panel discussion tonight, everyone. First of all, I'd love to thank all of you for coming along, giving up part of your evening. I know the Olympics are on, it's all very exciting. I know the rock climbing's there, which I'm particularly, both Marie and I are really excited about that. But it's been great to have you here, a part of this important conversation. I think Alice, John, Ryan, you're all on really important missions for social impact. And I'm just going to, just give me one moment here. I need to put this up. Sorry, technical difficulties. There we go. Oh, we've got a question there. There we go. My name is Alex. I'm an industrial design student at RMIT. My question for Tim or Ryan, how do you start bringing people on board for user-centered design? Alex, there is a program, a course you can do through RMIT Industrial Design called DAP, or Design Action Program. But it's your opportunity to do a internship with different businesses that might be using user-centered design principles and methodologies. So that's something I'd look up as my advice for trying to get some work in the industry. But back to thanking our amazing panelists. Thank you, Ryan. Thank you, Alice. Thank you, Dr. John Simons. But if any of you would like to continue some conversation with any of these three amazing individuals, Alice and John are particularly really well across the research side of thing, the methodologies, that really hard to navigate space, the behavior change. So please reach out to them. And of course, Ryan doing some amazing things there with Rove Wheelchairs and also Gecko Tracks. So before we finish off tonight, I'd also like to make my own sort of call to action. We've got some really exciting things coming up at Project Flock. And I'd like to ask your help there. The team and I at Project Flock are all about finding ways to get people working together on public roads and paths so we can all get home safe to family and friends. And, as we've been talking about tonight, I think that's a really common thread we all share. Our Flock light, our Flock bike light, just happens to be our first attempt at sort of trying to sort of change some of the thinking around what it is.
I think we just lost Tim.
Hello?
Oh, yeah, we can hear you.
How long was that off for?
Oh, about 15 seconds, I think.
All right, okay. I'm not sure why that happened. I'll just go from the top of this slide here. I just wanted to, we've got the our Flock light that we've been developing for the last couple of years now, but essentially what we're trying to do is, by lighting up the legs of the person riding the bike, we're just trying to essentially mean that people riding bikes are seen as people that are just trying to get home to their destination safely, and not just another flashing red light. But along with the biomotion lighting, we're also trying to address some really key pain points for people who ride bikes. And what's really cool is I'm pleased to announce that we are going to be launching our Flock light on Kickstarter this year. I'm not able to say the exact date yet, but we will be announcing it in the next couple of weeks. And I really need anyone's help that's still on the live stream tonight to please sign up. We've got the QR code there. come on the journey with us towards launching onto Kickstarter and what it's going to be like taking this product to the market. And of course, if you get in early enough on Kickstarter, there is the opportunity to get a really great discount on a flock light. So that's about it. Once again, thank you, John. Thank you, Alice, Ryan, and everyone that's watching. We have got some great support from RMIT Activator throughout our journey so far at Project Flock. So just in closing, I'm just going to be putting up a couple of promotional things that are happening at RMIT Activator later this month, but also we have the Launch Hub program, which is going ahead very soon, which are still taking entries. If you've got any cool ideas that you'd like some help getting off the ground. So thanks very much, everyone.
Thanks very much.
Telling me to dance, taking a chance. Telling me to dance, taking a chance. Telling me to dance, taking a chance.
All right. Thanks, everyone. See you around.